If you ask people around the world to name the most influential Chinese figures of the 20th century, one name appears again and again: Bruce Lee. Not because of how long his career lasted, not because of how many films he made, but because of how far his impact traveled. Bruce Lee was not just a movie star. He became a global cultural phenomenon at a time when Asian men were rarely allowed to stand at the center of Western attention. His face crossed borders, his name crossed languages, and his image reached places his films never officially screened. What's strange is this: much of the research, debate, and documentation about Bruce Lee didn't come from Hong Kong or mainland China. It came from overseas, from Western journalists, Western academics, Western audiences trying to understand why one man could leave such a deep mark in such a short time. And the more people studied him, the more uncomfortable the questions became. At the height of his fame, Bruce Lee was everywhere. Movie theaters sold out for days. Martial arts schools filled overnight. Imitations followed immediately. But alongside admiration came controversy. Some praised him as a revolutionary. Others saw him as dangerous, too aggressive, too outspoken, too unwilling to stay in his place. Unlike other stars of his era, Bruce Lee didn't play roles that softened him. He didn't bow. He didn't smile to make others comfortable. On screen, he stared directly into the audience. Off screen, he challenged systems that preferred silence. And that tension never went away. Because when someone rises this fast, the fall, if it comes, is never quiet. Bruce Lee's career didn't unfold slowly. It exploded. In the early 1970s, Hong Kong cinema was struggling. Audiences were losing interest. Studios were repeating the same formulas. Then one film changed everything: The Big Boss. The story itself was simple. What mattered was the presence. Bruce Lee didn't move like other actors. He didn't fight like they did. His speed felt unnatural. His intensity felt unscripted. Audiences didn't just watch. They reacted. Box office records collapsed. Lines wrapped around buildings. Overnight, Bruce Lee became the engine pulling an entire industry forward. But this was only the beginning, because what happened next pushed him from local superstardom into something far larger. After The Big Boss expectations were high, Bruce Lee could have repeated the formula. Another factory, another injustice, another explosion of violence. Instead, he chose something sharper: Fist of Fury. This time, the anger wasn't personal, it was cultural. The film tapped into humiliation that audiences didn't need explained. When Bruce Lee walked into a Japanese dojo and destroyed symbols meant to belittle Chinese people, theaters erupted. People shouted at the screen. Some stood up. Others cried. This wasn't just entertainment. It felt like release. And suddenly, Bruce Lee wasn't just selling tickets. He was channeling something much older and much deeper. What many people forget is how quickly this all happened. Within months, Bruce Lee went from a rising star to the face of an entire movement. Studios adjusted their schedules around him. Directors rewrote scenes just to fit his presence. But Bruce Lee wasn't satisfied. He didn't want to be controlled by scripts written for him. He didn't want to follow rules designed by people who didn't understand what he was building. So he took control. With The Way of the Dragon, Bruce Lee wrote the story himself. He directed it. He starred in it. And he made a decision no Hong Kong production had made before. He took the film to Europe. When Bruce Lee fought Chuck Norris inside the Roman Colosseum, the message was clear. This wasn't East versus West. This was Bruce Lee declaring independence, not just from studios, from limitations. Hollywood had noticed Bruce Lee long before this, but noticing someone and accepting them are very different things. For years, Bruce Lee lived in America. He taught martial arts to celebrities. He appeared in television roles that never fully used him. He waited while others were promoted ahead of him. To Hollywood, he was useful, but not central. That changed after Hong Kong. Suddenly, the man they had overlooked was breaking records overseas. Audiences were proving something studios had ignored. Bruce Lee didn't need Hollywood to validate him. Hollywood needed Bruce Lee, and that realization arrived too late to slow him down. Enter, the Dragon was meant to be the bridge. A true collaboration. An international production. Bruce Lee as the undisputed lead. Everything about the film was designed to introduce him to the world on his own terms. The martial arts were raw, the characters were dangerous, the tone was darker than anything mainstream audiences were used to. Behind the scenes, Bruce Lee was already thinking ahead. He wasn't planning to stop. He was planning to escalate. One project followed another. Scripts stacked up, ideas multiplied, and among them was a film that mattered more to him than all the others. Game of Death. Unlike his earlier work, Game of Death wasn't just a movie. It was a statement. Bruce Lee wanted it to reflect his philosophy, his belief that rigid systems fail, that survival belongs to those who adapt. That power isn't about strength alone. He redesigned the structure. He rewrote scenes. He refused compromises. Those close to him noticed the pressure increasing. The workload intensified. The expectations grew heavier, and the pace never slowed. To the outside world, Bruce Lee looked unstoppable, but inside that momentum, something else was forming. Something few people noticed at the time. Because when success accelerates this fast, it doesn't always give the body time to keep up. July 20th, 1973 didn't feel historic when it began. Bruce Lee woke up with plans already in motion. Meetings, phone calls, a schedule packed tighter than usual. Game of Death was no longer an idea, it was a priority. That afternoon, he met with Raymond Chow, the head of Golden Harvest. They discussed the project, scenes, casting, financing. Nothing about that meeting suggested urgency or danger. Bruce Lee wasn't slowing down. If anything, he was accelerating. And that detail matters later. After the meeting, Bruce Lee and Raymond Chow went to the apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei. The reason was simple. Continue the discussion. Finalize creative details. Then, head out for dinner. At some point during the visit, Bruce Lee complained of a headache. No one reacted strongly. Headaches weren't new for him. People close to Bruce Lee would later say this wasn't unusual during intense work periods. He pushed long hours. He slept irregularly. He demanded precision from himself and everyone around him. So when he said he needed to lie down, the room didn't stop. That decision would later be questioned more than any other. Before resting, Bruce Lee took a painkiller. Not an experimental substance, not an unknown drug. It was Exposé, a medication combining aspirin and a muscle relaxant. It had been prescribed before. It had been used before, and that familiarity is exactly why no one panicked. Bruce Lee went into a bedroom and lay down. Raymond Chow left shortly after heading to the restaurant where they were supposed to meet later that evening. Time passed. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then, the silence lasted too long. When Betty Ting Pei checked on Bruce Lee hours later, something felt off. He wasn't responding. She tried again. And again. There was no movement. Phones were picked up. Calls were made. Raymond Chow rushed back. A private doctor was contacted. Attempts were made to wake him. They didn't work. By the time emergency services were called, urgency had replaced confusion. When the ambulance arrived, Bruce Lee was already unconscious. He was rushed to Queen Elizabeth Hospital. At 1:13 p.m., Bruce Lee was pronounced dead, 32 years old. The news spread instantly, but the details did not. Almost immediately, the story began to fracture. Public statements described a sudden collapse. Medical documents recorded specific times. Witness accounts told a slightly different sequence. Reporters noticed the gaps. How long had Bruce Lee been unresponsive before help arrived? Why did certain timestamps fail to align? And why did early explanations change within days? By the next morning, the world knew Bruce Lee was gone. By the end of the week, the world was arguing about how. Because the cleaner the official version sounded, the more questions it left behind. And those questions weren't going away. Not this time. The official investigation didn't take long. An autopsy was conducted. Reports were written. A conclusion was reached. Bruce Lee's cause of death was listed as cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. The ruling described it as a misadventure triggered by a severe reaction to medication. On paper, it sounded clinical, controlled. final. But for many people, it didn't explain enough. Because cerebral edema isn't a cause by itself. It's a result. And what caused it became the real argument. The painkiller Bruce Lee took that day came under immediate scrutiny. Exposé, a combination drug that included aspirin and a muscle relaxant. At the time, it was widely prescribed, but it wasn't harmless. In rare cases, it had been linked to serious reactions. Officials stated that Bruce Lee had suffered a hypersensitive response. What made people uneasy was something else. Bruce Lee had taken this medication before, more than once. If the drug was familiar, why did it suddenly turn fatal? Why did the reaction appear so extreme, so fast? Toxicology reports added another layer. Trace substances were mentioned, but authorities emphasized they were not the direct cause of death. For the public, that distinction felt thin, because once the word drugs entered the conversation, it never left. Attention then shifted to Bruce Lee's body itself. Friends later described a man who never stopped experimenting, training methods that pushed limits, recovery techniques that promised faster results, supplements, muscle relaxants, strict diets, constant adjustments. Bruce Lee treated his body like a machine. If something claimed to increase efficiency, he tested it. If a method reduced recovery time, he adopted it. If discomfort was the price, he paid it. Some methods were ahead of their time. Others were untested. Years later, doctors and researchers would question whether the combination of extreme training, medication, and relentless workload created conditions no single factor could explain on its own. The official verdict closed the case, but it didn't close the debate. Because once people started asking whether discipline had crossed into damage, the story changed. This was no longer just about how Bruce Lee died. It was about how far he had pushed himself before that day ever arrived. After his death, the conversation shifted again. This time, it wasn't about medicine or timelines. It was about ability. Was Bruce Lee truly as formidable as the screen suggested? Supporters pointed to demonstrations that stunned experienced fighters. The one-inch punch, speed tests captured on film, witnesses who claimed his strikes landed before the eye could track them. Critics weren't convinced. They argued that cinema magnified his skills, that some techniques looked spectacular but carried risks in real combat, that choreography and camera angles mattered more than people wanted to admit. Even within the martial arts community, opinions split. Some called him a once-in-a-generation innovator. Others quietly suggested that admiration had turned into exaggeration. The louder the legend became, the harder it was to question it openly. And then there was the philosophy, be water. Those two words outlived every argument. More than the films, more than the controversies, more than the debates about how he died, they traveled far beyond martial arts. Into business, into self-help, into everyday language. But there's a tension few people talk about. A man who preached adaptability lived under constant pressure. A man who rejected rigid systems pushed himself with relentless discipline. A man who warned against excess may have lived right on its edge. So the story remains unfinished. Was Bruce Lee undone by a single reaction? Or by years of testing limits without pause? The investigation ended. The theories multiplied. And the questions never settled. Because when someone rises this fast, burns this bright, and disappears this, suddenly the world doesn't just remember the legend, it keeps searching for the cost.